Well, we're a couple minutes after, and the participant count seems to have stabilized a bit, so we'll get to it. So today we have the pleasure of hearing from Dr. Julie Mueller. Dr. Mueller has been a professor in the Faculty of Education since its inception in 2007, following a career as an elementary teacher in the Waterloo Region District School Board, teaching grades 1 to 6 and specializing in physical health and education. Following a return to Laurier to complete a PhD in social and developmental psychology, she now teaches undergraduate and graduate courses in the areas of learning and child development, health and physical education, computational thinking, and educational technology. Julie sees herself as a lifelong learner and uses her research to inform her teaching. That research has included the impact of digital technologies on learning for the past 15 years, exploring the barriers and supports that teachers face from preschool to higher education. Perpetual change in technology, moving from segregated computer labs to handheld one-to-one devices like the iPad, to cloud computing and collaborative documents, has made measurement of the direct impact of digital technology on learning almost elusive. However, examining the pedagogy or instructional techniques surrounding the integration of the technologies has resulted in a reciprocal model in which the technology drives change and the changes in learning direct advances in technologies. To add authenticity and validity to her research, Dr. Mueller works with partners in education that include local tech startups like Inksmith, Sesame, and VidHub, school boards, community organizations, and media partners like TVO. Her research is supported by Tri-Council grants, mid-tax internships, and the newly formed Center for Leading Research in Education, affectionately known as CLEARY. Dr. Mueller is excited to share with all of you today her passion, thoughts, research, and questions related to teaching and learning in our increasingly complex digital world. And with that, I'll hand it over to you.
Okay, thank you for the introduction, Josh. D2L has been an important academic partner in my research for more than a decade now on several levels, hosting a pre-conference for our Technology and Teacher Education Association during Congress in 2012, as a learning platform for online components of my courses, as a supporter of my colleague Steve Sider's work with the Educational Leadership Institute in Haiti, and as an employer of at least one of our Master of Education alumni. So I do hope that a relationship with our new Center for Leading Research in Education will become the newest connection between the Faculty of Education and Desire to Learn. But I'm very pleased to share the next hour with all of you to talk about learning and teaching in a digital world and what that looks like in the face of a global pandemic and an increasingly complex world. In this online context, it's likely that we are not all on the same tract of land, but I want to take just a minute to acknowledge the land that I live and work on and share the respect that I have for that land and the past and present stewards of that land. It's a moment of gratitude for me when I do a land acknowledgement. So this is a photo from Schmidt Woods in Baden. Some of you may know it, where I do many of my walk and talks, and in fact, where I prepared a good portion of this talk. This land is on the traditional territory used by the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and Neutral people. I encourage you, if possible, to look at the land on which you are learning today as we listen, discuss, and question. Try to consider how that land impacts your learning. I must also acknowledge that I do wish we were meeting in person today. I am missing the opportunity to walk about, absorb the energy in the room, and read your responses with body language and movement. However, we each may be in the environment that is most comfortable for us, and we're reaching folks who may not have been able to travel here in person. So what is key to any event or professional gathering is still applicable in our virtual environment. That is relationships, relationships, relationships. We have a limited time together today, and you've had a brief introduction to me, but I know very little about the 150 or so of you. I know you are employees of Desire to Learn and that you are here today as a lead into an inspirational week. I will take a few breaks throughout the talk to give you a chance to reflect and contribute as you like. I will be sharing my screen, so not looking at the chat while I'm speaking unless I specifically ask you to post. So I believe we are recording and your comments can be shared at the end. So I will be able to see your questions if we don't have time during the talk, at least on a follow-up later on. So let's dive right into the topic of the day. So I also want to admit that I wrote this talk several times and in several different ways, trying to anticipate what you are looking for. I'm a much better writer than I am speaker, so I always write my talks, my lectures, even my greeting card comments several times and in great detail, because educational research is very complex. There are many variables that can't be controlled, and everyone's been in school of some format, so most people think they know how teaching works. And indeed, most people do teach in their own way to someone at some point in their lives. I compose my talks, walking and talking, when I wake up in the middle of the night, in spoken text to myself, while I'm driving, in coffee shops, in my office. So this pretty much demonstrates what I hope is the inspirational thread in our talk today. And that is, it takes a village to teach a child, and you are all village members. We continue to learn regardless of our context. Certainly any talk, blog, journal article, and let's face it, most conversations that have happened in 2020 and 2021 are not immune to the impact of this global pandemic and are likely to contain some reference to it, as I will today. But I really want to focus on learning and teaching in a digital world and look at that pandemic as another event that impacts that. So we're going to look at the foundation of learning and teaching. So let's begin the dialogue then about learning in the digital age and our own COVID-19 village, and be inspired to raise the learner in our own context. So anytime I take part in professional learning, I try to take one thing away to make it worthwhile. I've put the time in, I've registered, I've attended. So I believe you need to put in what you want to get out. So that may be the phys ed teacher in me coming through. That being said, I want you and I to change this professional learning event to a purposeful learning event. I hope that it does indeed inspire you in your professional and or personal life moving forward. And what I really want you to do is to wing it. Before I begin to share the content of my talk, we'll take just a few minutes to address your wing. And that is your wants, your needs, and your goals. So what is it that you want to get out of today's talk? Is it information, new research, a chance to turn off your camera, shut your eyes, and listen, a connection with another coworker who asks a question you might be interested in? So what's your desire this afternoon? Also think about what you need to get out of today's talk. That is something that might be required or that serves a professional or personal purpose. So perhaps you need to add a presentation to an annual progress report. Perhaps you need to work from home today, and this allows you to do it. Perhaps you need to add some knowledge about learning theory to your toolkit. And then think about what is a goal of today's talk. So what's your end game? That will likely be connected to your need and or your want. It's an outcome. Going in, we need to know where we want to end. So you can plan for it. Look at your need or want and think about a goal that might address it. If you need to add knowledge about learning theory, you might make asking a question related to learning theory a goal. If you want to make a connection with a coworker, you might copy the list of participants and send a chat to someone who asks a question that sparks your interest. So take a minute now and record your wing on a napkin, with a pen, with your finger in the sugar you spilled when you were putting your coffee together, on your phone, in a Google document, somewhere concrete. You don't need to share it, but make it concrete. Yeah, I will give you just 30 seconds or so. And we have a very large number. We're up to 196. So I don't think we'll share together, but I want you to have it concrete and hold on to that yourself. So if you thought you didn't have to do any work today because I was speaking, I just blew that out of the water. Okay. Hopefully you have some idea of your focus for today's talk. So the first section of this talk will address learning in the digital world. So setting education or learning on the foundation of learning theory really gives you an overview of where digital fluency and what I consider to be the new basics are set in learning. So the learner, whether a preschooler or a D2L engineer, is at the center of the learning context, with influences on that learner coming from systems emanating from those close and intimate circles to larger global influences. So the degree of impact from those influences changes according to the developmental stage of the learner. A very young child is, there's more influence on those close to them, their family. As they grow older, their peers. If you are an adult learner, the outer circles may have more of an impact. Right? It changes with the learning environment, the cultural impacts, and world events. For instance, our current global pandemic shifted the influence of the medical community from a very peripheral influence on education to a key and often sole influence this year. Many major and tragic events of the past 2 years and anti-racism movements in equity, diversity, and inclusion have brightened the light shining on the purpose of public education and the broader influence of society. So Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems theory, which is pictured here, captures a favorite quote of mine, which you've heard already today: "It takes a village to raise a child." Bronfenbrenner recognizes that many influences, variables, contexts that have an impact on the learner. In his case, the reference was to a child, but the same systems theory can be applied to lifelong learning and the complexity of formal and informal learning. Whether you are a computer engineer building a digital learning platform, or a parent helping your child interpret an interaction with a neighbor, you are contributing to learning. You are an educator at some point in some place in the system. So the premise behind this theory may seem like common sense, but much research has been done to tease out the influence of individual components of the systems. For example, how much the teacher is responsible for the academic outcomes of the student in comparison to something like social economic status. This framework encourages us to acknowledge the complexity of learning and education and to address the whole child or the whole learner. So the context of learning in an increasing complex and constantly changing digital world doesn't necessarily change the way we learn. At the learner level, that is, our sensory perception and memory mechanisms still work the same. And we need to still engage the learner. We need to attend to the executive function and working memory processes that are the tools of learning, ensuring that we chunk information that needs to be committed to memory, to consider cognitive load, how much we're asking the learner to hold in memory while conducting higher order thinking processes. So all of that remains the same. Learning theory has developed along a timeline, with bodies of research informing theories as sets of tested principles. So foundational theories are based on empirical studies of well thought out hypotheses that are tested in multiple contexts across multiple times. So learning theory has a long history, from behaviorism, where learning is based on stimulus and reinforcement, to cognitivism, that addresses the cognitive processes of perception, memory, and thinking, where the learning is invisible, right? To constructivism, where active construction of knowledge is seen as learning. And more recently, connectivism, focusing on the connections of neural networks and associations and the multiple sources of learning. So this learning is still being developed to assist in explaining artificial intelligence, learning across multiple sources and nodes. So more of a development as we went through learning theory. On the other hand, if we look at pedagogical responses to learning theory, and you'll hear me use the word pedagogy many times today, and it really refers to the strategies, how we go about teaching. So the teaching strategies, the art of teaching. So pedagogical responses to learning theory, so the explanation of how we learn. So those approaches taken to teaching and learning based on that theory will often take a pendulum swing rather than a tested timeline or step-by-step transformation. So how people respond to some of those theories and new developments, world events, changes in education policy and practice. So for example, let me give you an example. A focus on phonics in reading instruction was based on cognitive learning theory, really focusing in on what's happening in the brain, the phonological loop, memory, auditory processes, so very functional. So the pendulum was looking at, the pendulum is swung to the side of phonics, and how we go about teaching it then was based on that. So there was a lot of worksheets and sounds and very structured. Okay, then in response to a more constructivist learning theory, a whole language approach to reading was developed that in many ways dismissed phonics to set reading in context and look at the whole child and the whole text. So they pretty much dismissed phonics and said, we don't need all of that. We need to look at the meaning of what you're reading. So the pendulum swung quite widely from one approach to another. And what has happened is a balanced approach to reading resulted in the pendulum swinging back to the middle, where phonics was seen as an important aspect of reading, while still recognizing that context had to be considered. So current and emerging learning theory go beyond the cognitive processes that are happening during learning and highlight the importance of active social learning. So the social co-construction of knowledge and the connected learning nodes that have developed as a result of the rapidly changing cultural tools that we all use in everyday life and in our educational environments. So why is learning theory important? It helps us make decisions about how to teach when the what we teach changes and the where we teach changes, like a swing to remote learning. The pendulum swing was hard and rapid from mostly face-to-face to fully remote and online. So rather than swinging back to fully face-to-face, we may want to look at the impact of that remote learning and the pandemic more generally in all of those systems affecting education. It's important that we take time, now that we have it, almost 2 years later, to examine the learning context, the impact of world events, the influence of social media, the possibilities of technology, and the needs of the learner and greater society in continuing to advance learning and clarify the purpose of public education. So the data that we collect through platforms like those that D2L designs and supports is a key piece of evidence, but certainly not sufficient. What are the outcomes that we want to measure? Is it equitable access? So much discussion in the public venue has been around students, learners don't have equal access to the technology, to teachers, to support. So are we measuring? Success would be if that is equal. Is it success measured by income and the jobs that students get when they leave school? Is it time on screen? There's been much talk and measurement about how much time children are spending on screen. Is it numbers of children needing support? Is it teacher sick days? Is it case numbers of COVID-19 or all of the above? So we need to use established and emerging learning theory to inform our teaching and learning strategies, to identify our desired outcomes, and decide how to measure them while addressing the whole learner in the center of that ecological system. Sounds pretty easy, hey? So within our Faculty of Education, we are always teaching from two streams, teaching about the what and teaching how. That is, educators need to know what they are teaching, the content, the domain knowledge, as well as the most effective pedagogy. There's that word again, the how to teach that knowledge. So the content that we are teaching in a digital world may change in terms of emphasis. A global perspective around economics, for example, and in terms of skills, adding how to create an infographic, how to code, how to download music, how to critique unfiltered news. So the pedagogy, so what we're teaching might change, but also the pedagogy could change. We may do collective brainstorming in a collaborative document before we ever meet in person, and then have students analyze the themes and search for support in an inquiry approach. With some refer to this as a flipped classroom approach, where the inquiry and preparation is done before the class, rather than giving information during class and then doing the analysis and reflection as homework after class. So here again, our learning theory that supports this co-construction of knowledge and the technology that we're using may inform what our education looks like in a digital world. Another very important domain was added to this model, the one I just referred to, and that's technology. So Mishra and Kaler in 2006 added technology as another very important domain for teacher knowledge. What do you need to know about, right? And then the sweet spot is what is referred to as TPAC. So technological, pedagogical, and content knowledge, integrating the three different domains. The what, the content, the how, the pedagogy, and with what, the digital technology, that are most effective in teaching a particular construct, theory, etc. So this model has expanded since, to include the context in which you're teaching. So things like a global pandemic, things like online rather than face-to-face. Knowing who your learner is, what impact those influences that we just talked about in Bronfenbrenner's model, knowing how all of that impacts the learning is key. So that context and the systems influencing the learner, as well as the technology, content, and pedagogy to be taught and learned, are the village that is raising the child, or in this case, teaching the learner. So what is it that learners in the digital age need to learn? What do we see in that content circle of the TPAC model in our digital age? The new basics include what researchers and educators have identified as 21st century skills, global competencies, digital literacy, or digital fluency. Our evolving digital age increasingly demands that a larger portion of society be not only digitally literate, but fluent, able to learn and work in that digital space. And the current global pandemic has amplified that need. To be successful in our new virtual world, we're going to need to become fluent, not just as consumers, but as users and creators of digital technology and innovators of solutions to complex problems. And the folks in this room, in this Zoom room, you are definitely part of that solution. So digital fluency can be considered a combination of digital proficiency, being able to understand, choose, and use appropriate technologies and systems. So you have to know how to download that QR code, how to scan a picture. Digital literacy, the cognitive competency to read, create, and evaluate using digital technologies and apply technical skills. So understanding not only how to use it, but when to use a technology, perhaps. And then the third aspect of fluency includes social competence or dispositional knowledge, being able to relate to others in the digital context and address moral and social questions related to digital technologies, privacy issues, when to share, what to share. All aspects of this digital fluency need to be addressed in our current education expectations. Teachers need to develop the content knowledge, what learners need to know and be able to do to be digitally fluent, the pedagogical knowledge, how do we best teach these skills, like computational thinking and coding, for example, and the technological knowledge, what tools do we use to teach these skills, what hardware should we be using, and how does this technology work? So to be fluent, we need to use these skills and knowledge in authentic settings. We need to have experts helping to raise the learner. Now more than ever, it does indeed take a village. Each of you at D2L may be a member of that village. As a teacher educator, my contribution to the village is less related to the content and technology that drives digital fluency or responds to digital fluency, and most connected to the pedagogy necessary. How are we going to do this? So let's just take a minute and have you consider what it is that you think you might contribute to the development of digital fluency in our community. So I'm just going to breathe for a second here. And I want you to think about no more than 5 words. So I tell my students a fistful of thought, 5 words to describe your contribution. And I want you to type it into the chat, but do not press send until we've all had a chance to consider it. So this is a technique we call a waterfall. You may have used it. When we've given people time, I will say send, and then you can all press send to share at the same time. This gives everybody a chance to think before they see someone else's idea. And we will have a record of how we think this community is already contributing to digital fluency, or how you might contribute. So just take a second, and it's only 5 words. It seems like that shouldn't take long, but we all know it takes longer to précis your thought down into 5 quality words. So I'll just give you a second, and then I'll ask you now to hit send and add your thought to the chat. Let's see some parents. Accessible tools. Empowering learners. Do you, as D2L, perhaps require digital fluency rather than contributing? Excellent. Okay. And I think we do. And we've seen that happen in the pandemic, that we learn through necessity, right? Excellent. Thank you for your contributions. So the specific aspects of digital fluency is where I'm going to focus next. So this is just one piece of digital fluency. What are the basics that we need to include within the curriculum and across society that add to digital fluency by developing a way of thinking that supports the digital age? These are the concepts, skills, and perspectives listed here that Brennan and Resnick present. There are a multitude of definitions, and again, some of this may be very familiar to you, or it may be new terminology. Right? But the key components of computational thinking combine to describe a specific method of problem solving. It includes decomposition or defining a problem, pattern recognition, abstraction, taking out the unnecessary parts, making sure you can use this in another context, iteration, testing, debugging, failing, and starting again. So all of that is part of a way of thinking. And my recent research has investigated where these concepts, skills, and perspectives related to computational thinking are found in the curriculum, how we go about assessing these skills. So when I refer to computational thinking in my research and work with elementary and secondary students and teachers, I think of computational thinking as a way of thinking. The literature related to computational thinking and its prevalence in education beyond computer science is generally credited to Jeanette Wing, who suggested in 2006, so 15 years ago, that learners outside of computer science needed to learn the many skills that computer scientists use in solving problems. That was just after those leaving secondary school now were starting kindergarten. So it's been there throughout their education. So although it's not new, computational thinking hasn't necessarily been embedded into our curriculum or teacher education. The learning theory to drive the pedagogy is not necessarily developed and utilized, which is one reason why I do this research. Many think about computational thinking as just computer coding. But if we consider CT, I'm going to call it CT for the rest of the session, to be a way of thinking, it is much broader than that. Rather than a computer skill, it's a way of thinking across subject areas or a specific approach to problem solving that may or may not include a computer and coding. It's using a logical process to solve a problem. Decomposing problems, creating algorithms, step-by-step solutions, testing them, debugging, seeing why something didn't work, trying again. So this is probably, again, as I mentioned, second nature to some of you, but perhaps not. So what might learners be doing, younger learners in our K-8 environment, for example? What might they be doing across disciplines or subject areas if they're using CT? It may be more obvious in something like computer science, where learners are actually conducting analysis or debugging code, but those same concepts and skills can be seen in social studies as learners identify trends in population growth or reroute a map to avoid construction. And perhaps even less obvious in language, when they analyze the structure of a sentence in a grammar class, coding words as parts of speech, or testing a thesis in an essay. So what does computational thinking look like for these young learners? We asked this research question in a study culminating in a paper entitled Hiding in Plain Sight. What does CT in problem solving look like in K-8 learning? So we turned to the expectations in the existing curriculum, the outcomes that are listed by the Ontario Ministry of Education in all subject areas, and the material from which teachers work backwards to plan lessons to assess and evaluate learning. So what shows up on the report card? What are we evaluating? What are we teaching? I won't go into the details of the findings today. I'm happy to share that work in more detail if you're interested at another time. Although the full term, computational thinking, did not explicitly appear in any of the documents, the computational concepts, practices, and perspectives that I posted on the last slide were embedded in all subject areas. For example, the health and phys ed document refers to questioning in its front matter, and that front matter is what explains to teachers how they should be teaching that material. And the quote was, "Are questioning techniques being used to reveal meaning and to encourage student engagement in reflection about and sense of a responsibility for learning?" So taking an approach to learning that has students questioning. The language document in grade 4 referred to sequence. Make revisions to improve the content, clarity, and interest of their written work using several strategies. Reordering sentences, removing repetition or unnecessary information, sounds like abstraction, changing the sequence of ideas. The mathematics grade 6 document refers to connecting. Make connections among mathematical concepts and procedures. And finally, the science and technology grade 8 document referred to testing when making or experimenting with and testing devices. So the terminology describing the specific skills and practices of computational thinking were really only found in the science curriculum, so that the language that we use in more specific computer-assisted computational thinking, the frequencies of perspectives or approaches required for computational thinking were spread more evenly across disciplines, but most frequently in the language curriculum, both English and French as a second language. The word computational alone did appear in the mathematics curriculum, which really helps contribute to the perception that CT is only about mathematics. While teachers may not be overtly aware of CT in the curriculum, Students are already being exposed to these concepts and perspectives. So this supports the view that coding could be an accessible and important mode for creating rich learning environments that facilitate the development of CT across disciplines. So making this explicit as a way of solving problems brings CT into a learner's repertoire of strategies. I can imagine sharing the syntax behind the tools learners are using in their D2L platforms to engage them in the computational thinking involved in their learning management system beyond a point and click, helping them understand how it works. So since this examination of the curriculum, the mathematics document has been updated to include specific expectations related to coding. So it's been put into the mathematics curriculum. And the Ministry of Education has chosen to house explicit teaching of computational thinking in the mathematics curriculum through coding. It's important to note the overall expectations are found in the algebra strand of mathematics, and they're similar across grades with just changes in aspects of coding. So grade 1s might be using Scratch to move a character across a screen, while a student in grade 6 might use much more complex code for data analysis and decision making, perhaps in making predictions from models based on data of simulations for COVID spread. So this is the changing content that we would see in the TPACK model of digital fluency. Those circles of content and technological knowledge include expertise in areas that teachers may not already be knowledgeable in, and that is advancing at a breakneck pace, presenting challenges for integrating digital fluency and computational thinking. So where do we see this support? Well, one way to see how digital fluency is being addressed is to follow the funding. We invest in what we believe is important, and the federal government has identified coding as worthy of continued funding to the tune of more than $190 million since 2017. This funding initiative is seen as an investment in, and this is a quote, science, technology, engineering, and math-savvy future workforce. So that they want a workforce that is prepared for the challenges of competing in a digital economy. The funding, however, is distributed to only nonprofit agencies that compete through an application process and are required to demonstrate how they will reach a large number of students and teachers, with a focus on underrepresented groups that include girls, Indigenous youth, Black youth, youth with disabilities, and youth living in rural, remote, and northern communities. So this is certainly an example of engaging the community and taking advantage of expertise in technology. Recipients include well-established organizations like Actua, Let's Talk Science, Media Smarts, Fair Chance Learning. Other groups that were formed or expanded in response to the call also received funding. Organizations like Code to Learn, Hacker Gals, Kids Code Jeunesse. Some of these may sound familiar if you do have children and you're working with them on a regular basis. But despite the outreach made possible by this federal approach to education, it doesn't come without gaps that I've listed on the screen as well. The program and funding is federal, but our education systems are provincially funded and organized. There's competition for funding that rests on an organization's ability to write a successful proposal. There are two streams, student and teacher training, but not necessarily any change to teacher preparation. So the funding is not being funneled through faculties of education, and that curriculum may not be changing at the pace that it perhaps needs to. So there's been limited evaluation as well of the outcomes beyond the numbers involved in the program. So these organizations have to demonstrate how many teachers they've been in contact with, how many students have taken part in their programs, and where they come from across the country. So what we really need to do again is go back to our learning theory and our learning outcomes. What is it that we want students to know, and where should that funding go? we need to know how we are going to measure those. So I'll leave these sort of provocations as questions that you might consider and that need to be researched further. Feel free to contact me if you want to talk about ways to answer them. So the need for computational thinking as a necessary basic does not stop at the elementary and secondary level, although it's a good place to start. So digital fluency and computational thinking should also be a basic outcome for post-secondary graduates in all disciplines, not just computer science. So I'm in the midst of course development for a university-wide course titled Computational Thinking Across Disciplines. So the content has not changed due to the pandemic and remote learning, but the pedagogy has. So the delivery's been adjusted to be fully online rather than a computer lab with tutorials and face-to-face connections. So if we look at the development of the course with a TPACK framework, okay, we can see the content as digital fluency and computational thinking, skills needed for the future of work and learning. The pedagogy has changed to an online delivery using active learning with simulations and authentic collaborative projects. And the technology used includes a variety of coding platforms, microbits, web conferencing. Integrating across these components takes the technology and content together to perform coding to address CT. The web conferencing and collaborative documents allow for an asynchronous delivery with support in a synchronous fashion. So with the technology and the collaborative flexible delivery comes issues to be addressed, like privacy, equitable access. The remote learning and flexibility of the past 18 months has put the learner at the center of the framework. So rather than the TPACK and the knowledge, we need to consider the learner amongst all of this. At a recent working conference with the Canadian Association for Teacher Education, we enhanced this TPACK framework and included, outside the context, design thinking, taking an approach to instructional design that adds that empathy, the observing and understanding of the learner that we need to have to put them at the center of what we're doing. Not to cater to the learner in any kind of entitled way, but to address the learning theory, the content, pedagogy, and technology in a relevant context. So a term we used to present our framework at the conference was decisions in flux. So learners making choices about the problems they wish to solve rather than being presented with the problems. What is authentic and important to them? In this course, I'm going to use a case study, and I'm working with the Canadian Shield to use as an example of a response, an innovative response to a community need. That's the kind of learning that will really set our graduates in a position to contribute to the economy, to be successful. And these are the outcomes for that particular course. And again, I see it as basics for any graduate of a university degree rather than computer science or those interested in computers, but a way to address digital fluency. And adding that design thinking to the pedagogy and content is very different than a built curriculum with defined expectations. So design thinking demands we make space for the learner to brainstorm, to build, to share. So these steps are often referred to as empathizing, defining, ideating, prototyping, and testing. But regardless of the terminology, embedded in the process must be time and opportunity. So teachers go through this process in understanding their learners, empathizing through knowledge of development, past experience. They examine Ontario student records. They assess, they observe to understand the learner. And that's what they're going to need to do when students, and as they have returned to the classroom, we do as we always have and meet the learner where they are. So some of the influences that may have been in the outer circles of the system when students were actually in the classroom environment had a greater influence on the learning. So the family, the neighborhood, the economic environment of the family, and the influence of social organizations in some cases had much more influence than they had when children were in the classroom. So there's been and will continue to be research examining this gap that widened during the pandemic between those who had access to learning based on things like Wi-Fi speed, hardware support, and those who did not. So there's evidence to suggest identification of children at risk steeply declined during the pandemic when children were not attending school. The frontline workers who would usually call authorities were not in close contact with students. Here, food programs like Nutrition for Learning pivoted to provide supports in communities when children were not coming to the physical buildings. And that may be something that continues. So this disruption to education was certainly very visible and real to students, families, and educators alike. And Dr. Gallagher McKay is one of the research members of Cleary, and she was commissioned along with a group of scholars to write a report to inform the science advisory table. So we are beginning to research and measure the impact of the past 18 months. So this report addressed a multitude of impacts on both students and teachers, suggesting the learning loss that was often highlighted in the media might be measured by the somewhat controversial standardized tests in numeracy and literacy, but very current evidence may be related to student perception, with one school board reporting perceptions that 66% were worried about falling behind and 84% suggesting they learned better face-to-face than remotely. So understanding who we're working with and how they're responding to this pandemic. So the long-term and specific impact of the pandemic may not be measured for some time, but teachers and school systems need to meet those students where they are, address the social and emotional development and well-being, understanding and planning for re-entry and diagnostic assessment of that curriculum expectations to see where the gaps are and where we need to start from. Now, in exploring learning and teaching in a digital age, the learner must be at the center. The theory and principles behind learning, digital or otherwise, before, during, and after a pandemic are the foundation for the content, pedagogy, and technology. Research will need to be conducted in a formal, planned way to tease apart the outcomes of forced remote learning from effective online learning. Design thinking can inform instructional design that includes the choice and flexibility that addresses the many variables that impact learning in a digital age. A one-size-fits-all approach will no longer address the multiple purposes and formats of public education. Moving forward with a focus on digital fluency, flexibility, and authentic community-supported learning is the next step in advancing education. I'm going to take a breath again now and ask you again to look back at that concrete recording of your wants, your needs, your goals. So pull out your wing, wherever it is, and look at it again. I hope that we connected on at least one of those, and if not all of them. I hope it may have, at minimum, sparked a question or shown you a path to address. If you're willing, it would be useful for me to know what you recorded as a want, need, or goal, and your thoughts about my talk today. Since learning is that continuous loop of define, ideate, test, evaluate, and iterate, if you have a few minutes, I will take I'll put this link that is on the slide into the chat, I think, and you can use that to look at. Let me the Google form just to give me a little bit of feedback. And I'm just going to grab it here. And then, Josh, I think I am done chatting, and what I might do is stop sharing my screen once I get this in the chat. There we go. So that I can see any questions that might come up. I'll take us to the last slide. And that also has my email on it. So I'll give you a second. It's pretty straightforward, and you can just Google me as well.